Okay. So this is my buddy Russell. This little podcast experience is uh, evolving and changing. And um, what I normally do is I quickly summarize how I think we know each other. And then I'd love for you to say, you forgot about this or you're totally wrong about that. But um, basically, Russell and I both went to Princeton. Um, I just randomly, actually, my freshman year lived with one of the guys on the track team, and he was like one of the most talented people I'd ever met. He won best athlete in the country. It's like the high school Heisman Award. This is Trevor. And so this guy's a stud. Like I'd known some good athletes, but he played I think he had like 16 varsity letters. Like he'd played many sports in a season. And he was the most modest, down to earth guy. And I'm like, this is so cool. And so I hung out with him a lot, and he brought me into the track team. And most people at Princeton that only know me peripherally think that I was on the track team because I ate all my meals at the track team. I lived with the track team. Like I just kind of loved the culture. And I was closest with the mid distance guys, mid going into longer distance. And the 800, which Russell's a specialist in, is sort of, in my opinion, like sort of right on the line between the sprinters and the distance guys. And so you would be at some of the parties, or you'd be at the table in the dining hall or whatever. And we were always friendly, but I kind of rolled with the distance guys a little bit more. And so we were friends, but never like best friends. But I've just sort of followed your journey, and some of the things I want to talk about today, after I let you respond to this, is um, you were a national champion in the DMR, the distance medley relay, top of the line, like one of the best 800 runners in the country. And then had sort of a professional career after Princeton that I've never really asked you about. That was sort of, it always seemed like you almost got there, but never quite. Um, and we've both shared that we have struggled with mental health, which is something that comes up a lot in these discussions. And then, of course, the obvious, which is that you are a Black man and I am a white man. And so you've done quite a lot of work, which I'll let you talk about later, to really have an outsized impact on certain institutions in our country, and helping save them. And have a really interesting perspective, I think, on the current state of affairs as it pertains to Black Lives Matter or just systemic racism more broadly. So I just think there's a lot to talk about today. There's a lot to learn. I'm eager to pick your brain, and kind of, we haven't had a meaningful, we bumped into each other about a year ago at Princeton and had a nice chat in the dining hall. But other than that, it's not like we're calling each other up once a month and catching up like old buds. I haven't really talked like this since college. So I'm just really excited to hear about where your life's taken you and get your opinion on the world. Um, does that kind of summarize how we know each other, would you say, or am I leaving anything out?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I summarized it pretty well. We had a couple points of kind of overlap. So, I mean, obviously, you're very close with the guys on the track team, the middle distance dudes, and I was kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the distance squad because I literally trained with the sprinters and the distance guys. So I was kind of in between those two worlds. Also, you were a year above me, so you were much closer with the 2012 guys. Than my class, 2013. And then you were in Shere Khan, and I had a few people that I was cool with in that world. I wasn't in one of like the big acapella groups, but I was in DZAC, and there was a little bit of it. DZAC was a
Right.
dance group on campus, and so there was a little bit of kind of like art world crossover. And then, if I'm not mistaken, were you in Ivy?
I was.
Yeah. And so there were a lot of DZAC people in Ivy. Ivy is one of the eating clubs at Princeton. There's eating clubs are kind of like Princeton specific fraternities, sororities.
If you wanted to learn about white privilege, and you're like, where could I go to like really get a shot of just like right to the arm of like what is white privilege? you probably go to Ivy at Princeton.
Yes. So yeah, I think we had a few kind of points of overlap. But yeah, I think you kind of described it right. You know, we kind of knew each other like on the periphery. You know, knew each other, were friendly to each other. Would be very, very cordial and nice. But didn't really have too many like in-depth conversations, which I think that happens. At college campuses a lot. But it is cool that we have had so many communities that were in common, which is kind of
Yeah.
interesting.
And also I would just go a step further and say some of the people that we're drawn to in those communities, like a Peter Callahan comes to mind, like
Hmm.
people that are like ride or die, like I would take a bullet for Peter Callahan. Like the
Hmm.
people that you chose in say like MD middle distance, like are the people that I'm like, ooh, like that guy is just I love that dude. So
Hmm.
I think there's some transitive shit going on where I feel very close to you because
Mm.
your taste in people, shall we say, is very similar to my taste in people.
Yeah.
Um, but dude, let's get into it. I'm trying to get better at this. So we kind of came up with a rough outline, which is I want to hear more about your track journey. I want to talk about mental health and how that's affected you and how it's affected me and some learnings from that. Particularly, by the way, assuming your track journey is a story of like, I gave it my all and my all wasn't enough, more or less. That's a that's a brick wall that's hard to run into if you're not feeling 100% at peace with yourself. And so I'm really eager to hear about that because I've had similar experiences. Then I'd love to talk about um, you basically single-handedly saving the Brown University track program and maybe I'm overstating it, but you penned an article on Medium that went mega viral. Malcolm Gladwell was talking about it and so on, about the travesty of Brown University basically defunding a sports team that was largely Black athletes. So I'm really eager to hear about how that came about and what that experience was like. Like you wrote it probably for 100 of your friends and all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of people are reading it and commenting on it. So what's that like? And then maybe use that as a jumping off point to get into Black Lives Matter, and a lot of the things that are happening in our country right now. And we'll just see how it goes, and when you get tired of talking or I do, we'll just say enough's enough, or we'll save it for next time if we go too long.
Gotcha.
Does that sound good?
That's cool. Yeah, and I could be pretty verbose, so this might be a good lengthy conversation. So
Yeah, I barely talk, so hopefully hopefully it'll be mostly you. That was a joke. Okay, so yeah, tell me about your track journey, whatever you think is significant, whether it's talking about Princeton and um I watched that DMR. I was in an auditorium on Princeton's campus. It was your senior year and I just graduated and I came back to campus to watch it with
wow.
all the guys, and seeing you and Peter Callahan and Michael Williams and was it Austin who was the fourth
Awesome
guy?
Hallman, yeah.
Yeah, dude. I like Peter just out kicking everyone at the end. Like I love sports and I've seen a lot of amazing moments in professional sports. That DMR has got to be like top 3 all time, just like heart pumping, like let's go, baby. And like I was in an auditorium of 300 people, Russell, like watching you just fucking crush like and win a national championship in this
Yeah.
race. It was so cool. So yeah, tell me about your Princeton career with track and whatever way you think is relevant, and then what came after that.
Right. Okay, cool. Yeah. So I guess to start, that DMR was a really special experience for us, being that we had tried to make nationals in the DMR every year since my freshman year. And every year we would just miss it by 1 or 2 spots, 1 or 2 or 3 spots. And every year we would get faster, but the whole country would get faster. And so, it was, it was just kind of, frustrating to get closer and closer. Then one year Peter was injured, another year I was injured. So there were a couple of years our DMR didn't have the full kind of complement of the A team, but even without the A team, still almost made nationals. So to finally make nationals our senior year, and then not only to make nationals but to win was, an amazing kind of full circle moment, kind of seeing all this hard work and all of this kind of dedication and will to see our potential come to fruition actually kind of materialize into, a victory was awesome. And even the way that race played out was kind of like a metaphor for kind of our experience, because Michael Williams started in the back, then he crept up and then gave it to Austin, and he moved up a little bit, and then he gave it to me and I moved up a little bit, and then Peter got it, and then then he was able to win. If you watch that race from the beginning, it's not clear that we were going to be the team that won, because we were not in the front for a large portion of the race. So we literally moved up a few spots each leg, and kind of just staying steady and keeping our head down and doing what we can to move meaningfully forward step by step. Really was kind of like a metaphor for our experience as a unit.
That's one of the things I learned, like right off the bat when I fell in love with track at Princeton, was like, you go to your first, I didn't have a track team in high school, so I had no exposure. And I went to my first couple races and I'm like, oh shit, that guy's in the lead, he's going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And like to the uninitiated, the guy in the lead almost never wins. It's almost always someone out kicking him at the end because he's emotionally sort of exhausted from leading. Tell me what, I don't want to like make poetry where it oughtn't be, but tell me what it's like, so the DMR, for those who don't know, is, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's a 1,200 meter leg, then it's a 400 meter leg, then it's an 800 meter leg, and then it's a mile, a 1,600 meter leg.
Right.
And which is a little less than a mile. So it's called the distance medley relay because it really mixes these different specialists. A 400 runner and a 1,600 meter runner could not be more different in terms of their body type, in terms of how they train, and you're putting them in one race. So it's really cool because, as you said, you need that A team. Tell me what it's like. The 800 is kind of an interesting leg because it's the third leg. So as you said, Michael leads off, then you have the speed in Austin, the 400 leg, and then you have this 800 that's putting Peter, who is a miler, and some milers are kind of more consistent in how they run a race. Peter's like calling card is the Callahan kick, which is code for, the last 100 meters, he says, see ya, and has a gear that no one else has, and he's able to blow by everyone. Explain to me what that third leg is like mentally, because it's just come from a speed leg where even if Austin is amazing, which he is, he's only getting an extra second, right? At most off the other guys. You're the third leg. What kind of responsibility psychologically do you have in the race?
So the third leg of a DMR is essentially don't F it up. So that was my role. Do not F it up. And so I got the baton from Austin, and I knew my job was to ensure that I kept position, close the gap, because there was a pretty big gap between us and Penn State at that time, and then to try to get as close as possible to the lead. Now, Peter is not a person who liked to lead, and so I knew that I could not give him the baton in
first place.
Now, there's some people who are very comfortable with leading, and I could have given the baton.
Like if it had been the year before and Don had been running the mile leg, he would have preferred it in first, probably.
Yeah, well, yeah. There's some people. Yeah. There's some people who are just really good with who really kind of like getting it out and setting a really aggressive pace and making everyone kind of struggle behind them. Peter's comfort is to be able to respond to whatever pace that the person in front of them.
Sit and kick,
and then give him heck, that last 200. And so I remember in the 800 leg. I was closing rapidly on the Penn State guy, and I was at a position where I was like, okay, I'm getting tired. I need to kick, but I couldn't kick because I couldn't pass the Penn State guy, so I had to do this weird in between, and then I ended up kind of like locking up. Locking up means like you kind of get stiff, which was kind of funny because it's like, you would think, oh, you're getting tired, how could you kick? It was like, no, I was in the position where it's like I needed to either like sprint and finish the darn thing, you know what I mean? But I knew if I did that, I would have passed the Penn State guy, and we wouldn't have won if we did that. I would have given Peter a half a meter lead, or a meter lead, and that probably would have threw off his entire, comfort level in terms of strategy.
Dude,
And so yeah, you really have to do.
I love that story. Just sorry to cut you off, but by the way, everyone should hit pause right now and go and watch, like type in Princeton DMR 2013. Like it is such a fucking cool race. And if you're bored, fast forward to the moment where Russell gets the baton, which is probably like 4 minutes in or something. And
something like that, yeah.
And just watch the last two legs, because it really is, like, if you even mildly like track, it's so fucking cool. But I love the selflessness. Like I didn't know that story, and it makes sense knowing you and Peter. But like the selflessness of like you winning your leg, to anyone who doesn't know anything about track, sounds like a good thing. Mm-hmm. But what you're telling me is like, for the sake of the team and the sake of the DMR, you actually couldn't win your leg. Mm-hmm. You had to like pull up a little bit, which caused you to lock up lactic acid and like unable to kind of, so you had to have this kind of humbleness of like, I probably could beat this guy that I'm technically head to head with, but this is a team thing. And I want to put my guy, Peter, in the best spot possible to succeed. Mm-hmm. And not to ruin it for everyone, but Peter actually, I know Peter very well, and I know how he trains. I know where he likes to be. And he dropped to 5th in the race with maybe 600 meters left. Mm-hmm. Right. I watched him go from 2nd, 3rd, 4th. And I'm like, okay, Peter, what are you doing, dude? Like, I know you want to be 2nd or 3rd. You don't want to be boxed in. You're 5th now. Are you gassed? Like, do you have it in you? And then of course he did his little head thing he does and blew by everyone. But I love the selflessness of your story, that you kind of had the self-awareness to be like, me winning this is actually not in the best interest of everyone. Have you ever thought about it that way?
Not explicitly, but I think we all knew what we had to do. Everyone knew what we had to do. I mean, and I would recommend, if someone goes and watches the video, watch the whole thing. It's about 9 minutes and 30 seconds, so not too long of a race. Michael Williams was our first leg, and he knew that he could not get out super hard, that would not work for him, and that if he did that, he might blow up, which means that he might lose the pace and then end up putting us in a really bad position. So he knew that the best thing for him to do was to stay in the back, and then the last 400 try to pick off the people who are falling off. So that doesn't look the most glamorous, to be in the back of a national final that's on national television, but he knew that by doing that, that would put us in a better position. Giving Austin the baton when we're in 5th or 6th place versus giving him the baton when we're in 12th place is, is a big difference. But if Michael Williams tried to stay up with the leaders, he probably would have burnt out and then would have ended up giving us the baton in 12th, which would have destroyed, all hope that we had of getting on the podium. And then Austin knew that his job was to ensure that he tried to close the gap as much as possible, but also that he did so safely, that he had enough for that last 200 of the 400. And so we all knew that we had a part to play, in the collective goal of, giving Peter the best opportunity to bring it home. And so I really loved that aspect of it, and especially having the team aspect of an individual sport is kind of cool, because we're still operating individually, but we're operating individually towards a collective goal, which is pretty cool. And in a sport that's inherently individual, having that experience is it's pretty cool. But if you want to kind of talk more broadly about my experience as a Princeton athlete, it was interesting. So, I mean, I'm not going to lie and say that everything was smooth or linear, because it certainly wasn't. I definitely remember it, and I expressed this many times to a lot of my, my athlete, a lot of my former teammates at Princeton. Yeah, it was kind of hard for me at first. And the distance guys had a really tight, like strong, close unit, and I didn't really feel, a part of that. And I think part of it was because I was a different athlete than Princeton was used to. I mean, I was a 800-meter guy who was also, for Princeton standards, pretty fast in the 400. Like I was one of the fastest 400-meter guys on campus my entire time there. I was also, one of, if not the best, 800-meter guy. No, Peter
Yeah,
might
well,
have something to say
it
about
should be
that,
said.
but
It should be, yeah, right. It should be said, by the way, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the mid distance guys, let's say like 800 to a mile, or 800 to a little more than a mile, Princeton was elite, 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 elite. And then in terms of sprinters, like other than you and Austin, maybe Ivan here and there, like Princeton was very good, but there was a divide almost. Would you agree with that?
there was a little bit of a divide. And I will say that the distance guys certainly started to produce some really great results. But I do want to give some credit to the rest of the team. I mean we had guys become All-Americans in the triple jump and the long jump,
Right,
and
right.
pole vault, and hammer throw. Our 4x4 made nationals twice, and we finished, I think, 12th in the nation, and ended up breaking the Ivy League record, running a 3:05, which was one of the fastest times in the country when we ran it. So we were pretty well-rounded actually when I was there, which was a pretty kind of awesome thing to be a part of. I think the thing that was challenging, and I'm sure that things would have been done differently nowadays. But when I came in, it was me and a guy named Matt Gonzalez. And so I'm black and Matt is Hispanic. And we were two guys who were like 400, 800, but we were the only two guys. We were incoming freshmen. And the distance guys, everyone else who was middle distance came for preseason, and they were also on the cross country roster. Whereas Matt and we were not on the cross country roster. And so when we came to campus, all the distance guys already had kind of their culture. They already had their thing. They would do this thing called gray shirts, which was like a kind of a stupid little kind of tradition for the distance guys. Matt and myself, we weren't a part of that, so we never got a gray shirt or were a part of any of that kind of thing, because we were not on campus during the time when all the other guys were brought into campus. So we felt very like separate from the distance guys, especially that first year. I ended up getting closer in subsequent years, but Matt actually never really, was able to get over that first initial year. So that was kind of tough. And then also, since the distance guys were in cross country season, they were doing their workouts separately. Matt and myself, we were given workouts and often had to do them by ourselves. And so we literally were not training with the distance guys. We weren't, with the distance guys at all. And just optically also, Matt is Hispanic, I'm black. And then the distance team was pretty much all white. And so
Well, I was going to say that, Russell. I mean, just to state the obvious, and that's not just the Princeton team, right? Typically speaking, you look across, say, the Ivy League, which is what I knew best at the time. There are very few, Diego Estrada. I'm trying to think of other big names I know that aren't white dudes that were on the podium for a mile race or a 3K or something. Yeah. And then you look at sprinters, and a lot of the best guys in the Ivy League were black. Or other nationalities. So it's funny, right? Because to me, what you're describing is it makes sense that the distance guys are there for cross country, and they're running longer distances that you don't run, and that they have a chance to bond and all of that. So it's not overtly exclusionary, but because there is this sort of undeniable racial divide between a higher instance of black athletes in shorter distances and a higher instance of white athletes in longer distances, there is sort of this like exclusionary thing that happens. Am I putting too much weight on that, do you think, or is that like a thing?
I mean, yeah, I think that's true. I also just think that it's kind of, I don't think it was intentional. I think it just happened that way, but optically it didn't look great,
Right.
And it didn't feel great. And so, even though I knew that it wasn't designed in that way, even from the stance of the locker room. So the locker room was divided into two sections, and the distance guys were in one section, and then the rest of the team was in another section. Matt and I were the only two middle distance guys who were in the other locker room section. So because we weren't on the cross country roster. So none of it was intentional. But it still kind of had an impact where, it felt like we were very much so separate. And so that was kind of tough to deal with freshman year. It was also tough to deal with in a lot of ways. I mean, Princeton was just tough just in general. I actually really did not like Princeton my freshman year and really wanted to transfer. But then, one, Princeton, grade deflation, my grades were, whew, and I was like, wow, I ain't getting into no other school of similar caliber. But then also, I mean, Princeton's the #1 undergraduate, institution. It's like I could not go to my mom and say, hey, I want to go to another school. But she would say, wait, where are you going to go? It's #1, And so, so you just kind of, grin and bear it. I will say.
And what was your background like, Russell? Like where did you grow up and what was that like?
Right. So I'm from Philadelphia, from a working class, family, single parent household. So I never wanted for anything when I was growing up. I had a really, awesome, comfortable childhood. But it wasn't like there was a lot of access either. I couldn't, get anything I wanted. You know what I mean? As a kid, but I still ended up. We still ended up having a lot of things that a lot of kids, in Philly, didn't have. I went to really strong prep schools that gave me an awesome opportunity. Since I ran track, I ended up running all over the country every year. So every summer I was running, at national meets that were, anywhere from Florida to Seattle to everywhere in between. And so, I was very fortunate in that regard. I don't want to paint a picture, that I was kind of in abject poverty because that's just not true. But, just working class background, very different, from what, a lot of folks' backgrounds were in Princeton. When I came to Princeton, I was on, full aid, and I had a job in the dining hall, which also was interesting because I literally had to like go from practice, get on my bike, and sprint up to Rocky Matty. And I had, what was it called?
Could not be further from the track.
Oh, it was a mile. It was like extra workout. And then I had like quickly scarf down my food.
Thank God I can run a 4:04 mile, right?
Like I quickly scarf down my food, and then I had to work the machinery in the kitchen, which actually was funny enough. I actually kind of liked. It was kind of like a second workout.
Yeah.
It was kind of nice.
Wait, Russell, real quick, I want to go back to I don't want to put too much emphasis on this, but I think an interesting trope we could come back to later if you find it interesting, and I'm not pressing too hard on this. When people say the term systemic racism, some of it is malicious on its face. And some of it is just sort of inertia. Like there's systems in place that are sort of inherited systems that cause racism. And as I've been learning about it, I'm just interested in your thoughts. I'm just really intrigued by this picture you painted of like the locker room. That's like that's full on segregation, man. That's like Jim Crow segregation, or like you showing up to campus and feeling like these guys are already buddies with each other and I'm like totally on the outside, as is this other minority who is my teammate, and I'm not part of this thing, and you were able to bridge that divide later, or just I come from a working class family and a lot of these guys don't, or whatever. As you said, my suspicion is none of that was on its face racist. Like no one was going out of their way to exclude you because of your skin color, but perhaps just because of inherited sort of like the way things have been built over time, that is the punchline, which is that you are excluded because of your race. And I wonder if, whether it's now or later in the conversation, there are other things in our culture that are like that, where perhaps, like, say in this case, the mid-distance guys aren't like excluding you aggressively or maliciously, but there's a system in place that sort of allows that to happen without people stopping and saying, this isn't right. And we should be sort of actively trying to fix this, or putting a system in place where you are invited to preseason, even though you're not training for cross country, or you are part of this gray shirt indoctrination, even though, I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So I don't necessarily place any of the responsibility really on the guys on the team at that point, because they were also 18 to 22. A lot of people at that age unfortunately don't have a great deal of external insight. And I will say that it was just an unfortunate kind of set of circumstances. I mean, there were a couple people of color on the distance side. There's a guy who's a half black, half white, Asian guy. And they were fully a part of the distance crew. I just think it ended up happening this way because Matt and myself were the first guys that Princeton had in a very long time who were truly 400, 800 guys. And so they didn't really know how to basically deal with us. Yeah. We were kind of sliding in between training with the distance coach and then also training with the sprint coach, and so there wasn't really a really great system for that. And, that was kind of a tension that, in terms of the training plan, that was a tension that kind of persisted throughout my Princeton time. And, looking back, I think my training probably should have been structured a little differently. I definitely needed to do some distance workouts, but I needed to do them with a very specific focus on gearing me for the 800. So I'm not going to be a guy who can do a 5-mile tempo. Like that's not going to be really beneficial. But doing, a 1.5 mile tempos, and a tempo effort, for people who don't know, it's you have a certain pace that is not race pace, but it's still pretty aggressive, and you try to hold that pace for an entire run. And it's a really good kind of way of getting in really, really good shape. And so long story short, I think the way that things happened, my freshman year in particular at Princeton, it just ended up kind of being something that it just wasn't an ideal situation. And then the optics of it, and then also the way that, kind of Matt and myself felt, really kind of, it was just interesting, for lack of a better word. I think what we didn't have the awareness of then, which we hopefully have more awareness of now, is just to have the understanding that it takes, that we should take a step back and look at how things are kind of sitting, look at how things are impacting people, affecting people, and then kind of respond accordingly. I think, the coaches realized what had happened, but didn't really know how to respond. And so I guess, the response was kind of just to not respond, which I don't think is, is the appropriate thing to do. I think what's most appropriate is if there is a mistake like that made, where, structures are set up in a way that kind of ends up not allowing for people to be included in a specific way, to address it, to acknowledge the mistake and to address it.
Man, there's so much here. I want to move on to some of the other topics we wanted to discuss, but You know, for me, it's like, I can't remember the statistic, Russell, but it's high. It's something like 50-60% of Princeton students now, and this is very different as compared to 20, 30, 40 years ago. 50% are, I think it's like 60 or 70% are on scholarship of some kind, and like 40 or 50% are full ride. I might be getting that wrong, but it's a it's a much bigger chunk than it used to be. And just quickly, like, even if I'm wrong and it's half of those numbers, there are a lot of people, putting the track thing to one side for a second, but there are a lot of people that are coming in, you know, from a certain background and being sort of indoctrinated into an institution, a university that's history anyway is steeped in wealth and entitlement and sort of upper crust and whatever. And I wonder if that transition, it's something you hear about, like, okay, sure, like your education was paid for, but there are a lot of divides that exist between the 30% that are still part of that old world Ivy League upper crust and an increasing number of people that are coming in not from that background. And how can the university, other than saying, here's your tuition, and Princeton, it isn't a loan, it's paid in full, which is great. But what about after that? And what about when that student gets to campus, and how can we be more thoughtful about that integration so that you don't have this experience of someone coming to campus, and in your case on the track team, or someone else's case in the chess club or the East Asian Studies department, or just feeling like you don't belong? How can we be smarter about really thoughtfully integrating people? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I certainly have some thoughts on that. Well, first thought though, I kind of want to travel back to a kind of a topic we were just touching on. One thing that I do want to say is that I also think we need to think about how we look at things. And so, for instance, like no one, people often don't kind of question, if they see, a bunch of white students, or white people or what have you, kind of congregating together or traveling together or always hanging out in certain spots. But I know that, at least at Princeton, it was kind of known, okay, why do all the Black folks all work at Frisk? Why do all the Black folks, hang out in front of the TV in front of Frisk? Whereas like that same sort of kind of query isn't asked of, a lot of white people hanging out, white dominated spaces. And so, I do think that, as we move forward, we need to think about, okay, how do we assess and view these things? And then also, what responsibilities are we placing on which communities? And are those responsibilities being evenly applied? And so, are we expecting, the minorities to always be the ones to kind of integrate into, into quote unquote white dominated spaces? Or are we, thinking about how people should kind of integrate into different spaces at different times, and the fact that it's okay for people to also have spaces that are where they can kind of just connect with like people who are of like experience. Like,
Right.
I think
That's
those two
that's a
things.
really challenging line. This is a very charged thing, but just to take it from race to gender for a second, because there's really interesting data on this, just to inject this. I've been researching a lot on this because I find it fascinating. So in our country, nurses, it's 9x more likely that a nurse is a woman than a man. Okay. And then computer engineers, it's 5x more likely that it's a man than a woman. Okay. And people say, not everyone, but there's a school of thought that says that that's sort of a travesty. It's a function of inequality in our society, and that we need more women in STEM, say, or if men want to be nurses, they should be able to, and that it's emblematic of a societal problem that there's inequality with respect to gender. So the countries in the world that are the least, that have the most equal sort of representation of men and women are the Scandinavian countries, and the most of the Scandinavian countries is Sweden. So they did a study of 475,000 people in Sweden. And Sweden has a whole bunch of very heavy legislation in place to create an egalitarian system, equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, so that everyone has the same starting line. Men and women are equal. And there are 15 or 16 examples that you can Google of what Sweden has done to assure over the past 3 or 4 decades that men and women are equal. Okay. So social scientists go into Sweden and they're like, let's see what happens in a situation where there's equality of opportunity and men and women have the same starting line, unlike in the States where men have a starting line ahead of women. And as it turns out, 20x is the number of women to men nurses, and 20x is the number of men to women computer scientists. And so in the most equal society, when in theory, and you could argue and say, you know, there's inertia from past generations and so on, but when people are allowed to choose and they're left to their own devices and there isn't the societal pressures in place, the social scientists had a hypothesis that it would be that the outcome would be more equal, but in fact the outcome was less equal, and women doubled down on the things that interested them and the men doubled down on the things that interested them. I could go on and on. There's quite a lot of data on this, but the point is that sometimes there are differences and that people want. So it's interesting. You painted this picture of, you know, black dominated spaces like that scene in front of the TV at Frist, or the white dominated spaces. And I love the way that you framed it, that we need to think about, is it the minority's job to integrate into the white integrated spaces? Probably not. Is it the white dominated space's job to welcome the minority into that space? Probably more so. I think it's healthier if it's just people flowing where they want and being welcome where they want. But then also the last thing you said, which I find interesting, which is that, and sometimes it's okay actually, if people sort of want to spend time with like-minded people, whether that's like-minded because of race or gender or because of interest or what have you, and that people will find group identity, which is very big on Princeton's campus. Like, I rolled with Shere Khan. Like, I rolled with people who sang and rolled with the track team because I liked the track team. And like, when people size you up on Princeton's campus, they're like, okay, Russell, track team, DZAC, like they triangulate you. And they're like, okay, I understand Russell now. So your group identity on Princeton's campus, almost more than any other I'm aware of, is really significant. The groups you associate with really define you. So I know I just threw a lot at you, but I was just sort of responding to your concept of whose job is it to integrate with whom, and is it okay if integration doesn't happen, and can both of those things be true? I think the answer is yes, from my perspective.
I mean, I think it's, I mean, it's it's human to know, I mean, to kind of know that there are going to be times when you're just going to want to kind of identify or connect or hang out with people who, you know, have the same kind of experience that you have. But it's also important to not let that be, you know, your only experience. And I do think that for that latter point, more of that responsibility should be placed on, you know, people who are in the majority, you know, white people, and more specifically white men. Because here's the thing, even if Black people or Asian people or whomever, you know, they're hanging out with, you know, their crew, at the end of the day, still haven't engaged with a white world. You know what I mean? You still have to engage. And so that still happens. That still needs to happen. However, you know, if someone who is, you know, from an upper middle class or, you know, upper class background, you know, they're white, you know, at Princeton, you know, they're in a frat, and then they go into a one of the more elite or exclusive eating clubs. Their kind of interactions with different people on campus, whether that be race or socioeconomic, can be very small. And so I know that there was a lot of kind of like, and even thinking about how people party, like, there was a lot of kind of, okay, yeah, people need to go to the street and feel more comfortable there. But there was never kind of a expectation of, okay, well, we have Black Box, people should come to Black Box and feel more comfortable there,
You know what Princeton used to call the club that was for Black people? And this is 30 years ago.
What they used to call the club that was for Black people?
There was an eating club that was where Black students would hang out, in, like the club that they were a part of. This is 30 years ago.
Are you talking about the Third World Center?
Third World Center. That's what they call it.
Yeah. So that wasn't a eating club. It was more like the Carl Field Center. It was a cultural center, but the university actually, it was structured differently. So the university actually gave the Third World Center specific funding, and each affinity group president was a part of a council, and each of them lived in the Third World Center. So it actually ended up functioning kind of like an eating club. And so it's kind of like the Carl Field Center had,
people that lived there, and
right. Yeah. The Black Student Union president, the Asian Student Union president, the Latino, and all these different people.
I didn't know all that history, but I just find that so bizarre. That anyway, I want to ask one or two more questions on this, and then maybe we can move on.
Yeah, we're deep in the prison hole right now.
Well, I want to ask, but it's an interesting microcosm, right? So I want to ask in a second your prescriptions, which I know is a loaded question, so I'm going to give you a second to think about it. But what are some changes that could be made to sort of start to fix these problems? And then I just want to share a personal story with you before you answer that, which is the reason I did that little wave when you were saying, upper middle class, white in a elite eating club. Like you explained what eating clubs are. There are 12 of them. I think now they're 13 or 14, but I think only 6 or 7 of them are exclusive, meaning you have to apply and only roughly half get in. And then of the exclusive clubs are sort of 3 that are like the top of the top of the top. And they sort of rule the Princeton social scene. And it's Ivy, TI, and Cottage. And I was in Ivy, right? Which some would say might even be the top of the top of the top. So it's like really of a very elitist, bizarre world of sort of, you eat your meals there, you party there. You have to apply to get in. It's extremely competitive. At Ivy, you have to interview 10 strangers that are members of the club, and they vote you up and down. It's very bizarre. And you get in, and the story I want to share with you, man, is if Ivy were personified into a human being, at first glance, it might be me, right? It's like a white, wealthy kid from both my parents went to Princeton. That's what, when people think of Ivy, they think of that. And I'm here to tell you that I felt actively disgusted and actively unwelcome in Ivy for almost the entirety of my time in Ivy, which is half of your sophomore year, junior, and senior. I felt so unwelcome. There were kids that took the knob that I was just describing, hi, I'm the Ivy kid, that were literally I'm taking daddy's jet to Paris Fashion Week. Does anyone want to come? That shit happened. And it made me so uncomfortable. And the only friends that I have in Ivy to this day are the people in Shere Khan that I rolled with anyway. And then the people that actually had texture and were interesting and had interesting, weird stories. There's this one kid I always think of, Graham Ezzy. He's from Hawaii. He's the second best windsurfer. That's another good Google thing. You should Google it afterwards. This kid windsurfs and literally gets 20 to 30 feet of air off of waves, and incredibly talented, incredibly modest. Really, he was raised in Hawaii, has all these amazing life experiences, just a really fascinating guy. And those are the gems in Ivy, and there were people like that, but they were few and far between. And most of the people were elitist, single-minded, provincial, and very much stuck in an old sort of elitist Princeton thing. And I felt uncomfortable, as ostensibly the kind of person who that experience is designed for. So I just find it interesting that you were on the outside of that saying like, that's kind of fucked up. And I'm telling you, I was on the inside of that. And it's not just me, like there are a lot of people I've talked to about this that felt uncomfortable about what Ivy stood for in the eyes of campus. And in many ways, the reality of what it was, as defined, by the way, by a minority of people in the club, like 10 people that were sort of the hyper wealthy demagogues of the institution that gave it its reputation. And then there were a lot of us beneath that level that were sort of like, I don't like this. Why is it like this? And I look back on Ivy to this day, and with every passing year, have more and more disgust for having been part of that institution. So I just wanted to share that with you, that I didn't like it either during, and I was sort of too insecure and too eager to blame myself for not fitting into it, instead of being like, no, this is fucked up. But as I've gotten older and more confident in my voice and who I am, I think it's fucked up. And I think, yeah, I don't like how it's structured. I don't like what it stands for. I think it's a very conservative and old world way of being and existing. I think it's exclusionary, and I don't like it. Which I've never really said I hardly say out loud, and I've never said on a video like this. It's going to be shared with who knows how many people, but that's how I feel. And so maybe that's interesting to you to hear the other side, like someone that was inside that sort of evil institution, and like that I actually was feeling the same way you were on the outside, which is maybe why we were friendly, right? Because we were more similar than we were different in that way. But so I just wanted to share that with you, and then you can either respond to that, or if you want, I'd love to hear maybe some of your ideas or prescriptions of, for a place like Princeton that is definitionally integrating people with money and people who don't have money, or people that are Black who are mid-distance, sprinters, and people who are distance runners who are white, or people that are having to work jobs because they don't have money and they're working at Frist and hanging out there afterwards. How could we be more thoughtful, and what could the institution do to provide the space for people to integrate more authentically and more effortlessly?
I mean, that's a lot of good questions. So with regard to Ivy or any of the other eating clubs, which again, for people who are not familiar with Princeton, are basically fraternities or sororities, but it's Princeton specific. My only thing was, and we can't change our experience, obviously, because it already happened. But it's my hope that moving forward, that people who are in those spaces, and now Canon is now kind of a part of the upper tier now.
Were you in CAP, or were you not in an eating club?
I wasn't in. I was in Cloister for a hot second. I I got in the tower. But I ended up dropping because they just did not work with me regarding kind of finances. I could have gotten into.
Sorry, by the way, I said, were you in CAP, which is an interesting thing that I assumed, because track, all my track buddies were in CAP.
Right.
But that's another instance of sort of profiling where, you just assume these things. Like when I add together track team and DZAC, I guess actually track plus DZAC might equal tower, which is what you did. But
no, there's actually no reason why. I had no connections to tower. I literally picked the club that I didn't have any connections in. Okay. And that's why I bickered, because so there's no reason for me to bicker. I literally was like, I don't know people in this club, so let me just try this out, which is so weird. But I was like, okay, if I'm going to meet new people, I might as well go to the place that I don't know anybody. Because I probably could have gotten into Ivy, considering that I was in DZAC. You know what I mean? I probably, and I actually was pretty good friends with a bunch of people in Ivy. But whatever. Long story short, my thing is, I think whatever, spaces, students, or just people in life, whatever space they dominate, if you are in spaces that are, kind of reflective of a certain kind of privilege, and if your life is reflective of a certain kind of privilege, challenge yourself to also expose yourself to other spaces and to other experiences, because you need to have that context. And so that's the only thing that I was saying, whether people want to be an Ivy or whatever, it's not necessarily my concern. It's just that the issue is that there are a lot of people who are in spaces like Ivy who only ever experienced other people who are in spaces like Ivy. And so
Totally.
they never, had to think about what it's like to interact with people who are from different social and economic backgrounds, or go into spaces where they might be the minority. I wonder how many white Princeton students were in spaces where they were the racial minority. You know what I mean? And probably there aren't those many who can raise their hand and say.
Sorry, one last story for you on this
Yeah.
exact point, which I think is so brilliant, is, I was in Shere Khan a cappella group. That got me into Ivy because older Shere Khan members were in Ivy and like hooked it up, right? And so I'm in Shere Khan, I'm in Ivy, right? So I go from rehearsal to like dinner at Ivy with the same people, mostly white, and the same like drama and conversations, like, oh my God, did you hear so-and-so hooked up with so-and-so, or this happened, or da-da-da, like that, you're in that. And then I lived with track guys in like a big suite. And I always said to people, you know what I fucking love, man? Like, I'm in rehearsal and I'm at dinner at Ivy and I'm hearing about Sally hooking up with Steven and da-da-da. And it's all the same. And then I get back to my room and it's like, yo, did you hear like Dinkins like negative split his 800 a day? Like da-da-da. Like, did you hear about like this? Like, I'm going to do it like a tempo tomorrow. It's all this, like all these words, all this like culture that I'd never been exposed to, all this like just like this whole different world. And I knew the names, Russell, my senior year of like, I don't know, 100 elite runners across the country. Like I knew their splits. I was so in this world. My track buddies, Don slept in an altitude tent, which means of course that Joe did. And then, Greta, who was dating Don, and Brian Leung, and like all the guys I was living with were sleeping in tents at 14,000 feet. And all the machinery was in our common space. So I would go to Ivy and I'd get drunk with all my elitist white friends. And then I'd come home at 2 a.m. and all the runners were asleep because they had a workout in the morning. That noise is like all I can hear. Sometimes I'd like drunkenly trip over a cord and it would like, I'm like, oh my God, and an alarm would go off because the nitrogen and oxygen in the tanks, would be imbalanced. I'd be like, I'm going to kill Don. I'm going to kill Brian. Oh, like, get back in. And I just love this double life, man, of like, I had this experience over here, but then, 4 to the 5 guys that I was living with were on full ride financial aid. 4 to the 5, 5 out of 5 of the guys I was living with were athletes. 1 was football and 4 were track. All of them were in CAP or not in an eating club instead of Ivy. Like it couldn't have been a more, there was racial diversity. Like you couldn't really have picked a more diverse group of guys, and we all just kind of liked each other. And I was very much the outsider because I was going out and partying, or I was doing this, or I was doing things that they weren't doing. And I loved that. I loved coming home to that and kind of having this complete escape from what would have been a very insular, like Shere Khan a cappella to Ivy Club to Shere Khan a cappella. That was such a small little universe. And then I completely violated that universe by being, and some of my favorite nights at Princeton, Russell, were when I had pre-games in this room that you probably came to, like in Patton, that were like track guys and Shere Khan people and Ivy friends. And then this friend from like freshman year that was like a total math whiz, and Jeremy Silver. I don't know if you ever met him, but he kind of hung out with the track guys too. And he works for the NSA now and is a total math nerd and introvert. And I just loved bringing in all of these different pockets of campus and all these different interests and backgrounds, and like that when I think back on my happiest moments at Princeton, it was when I was in those rooms that couldn't have been more different. And the conversations were so textured, and I was the thread that bound it all. That's what lit me up, dude. And like the rooms where I was the most uncomfortable were the rooms where I looked around and like everyone like looked like me, or like, you know, everyone's daddy had some money or some shit, and like Ivy or whatever. And I'm not saying that that's, you know, but I'm just saying like that's when I felt the most uncomfortable, because it was so homogenous and it felt so like the aspects of myself that I wanted to challenge or sharpen or let evolve or experience something new would die because the conversations were so rectilinear.
Yeah,
Anyways,
no,
I
that's
just,
interesting.
I manufactured that. And I think you did too at Princeton. Like you found a way to dip your brush in a lot of different things, whether
I was in I was in way too many things, and I think that will probably lead into another part of a conversation.
yeah, let's change the subject.
No, it's fine, it's fine. But yeah, I mean, my main point was just, you know, for you know, and I don't know how many current Princeton students will be listening, but hopefully there will be some. You know, for them to, you know, especially those who come from some sort of, you know, for lack of a better term, majority experience, or you know, those who are, you know, come from more affluent backgrounds, those who are white identified, for them to really challenge themselves to enter into spaces where they're going to experience, you know, kind of a different people in terms of mindset, not necessarily mindset, but in terms of culture, in terms of race, in terms of socioeconomics, you know, just kind of going and experiencing, you know, different points of view, I think is really important, and especially on the context of a college campus. You know, you don't necessarily really have the opportunity in the same way after you graduate, which kind of is sad, but it's true. And so take advantage of that. And for people who are, you know, who have graduated and who are living their lives, you know, think about what assumptions that you may have, you know what I mean? And think about, you know, your own, you know, comfort level or discomfort level, and being in different spaces where you may not be, you know, you know, a part of the majority. Think about, you know, in your workplace, you know, what are ways that you can, you know, provide, you know, outreach or connection to people who may be of different experience than yourself. I think these are things that we, you know, we have to think about. And I think oftentimes kind of the burden of kind of outreach or connection is placed on those who are deemed quote unquote other. And I think we need to, you know, really challenge ourselves to think about the fact that, you know, other people need to be reaching out to those
Right.
individuals
I
as
could
well.
not agree more. There's some terrible statistic like sitting U.S. congressmen, like 35% of them or something don't have a passport. I think the stat is. Well,
Really?
it's an
Wow.
absurdly high number. I made up the number, as people often do, but it's like
It's really high. It's high.
a number, right? And it's like these are the people that are shaping our like domestic legislation and policies, but also like foreign policy and how we're interacting with the world. And a lot of them have never even goddamn left the country,
I
man.
mean, it's the world's most deliberative body. I mean, the world's most important deliberative body, apparently, right? And so you would hope that the
They'd have
people
some
who,
perspective, right? They'd like have seen how other people do things. Like, okay, I went to Ecuador and that was sort of interesting for this reason. And then I went to China and then I went over here and okay, now I kind of think about things differently. And yes, I think whether it's like I think Princeton, I'm glad we lingered on it for so long because it's a really interesting microcosm of a lot of these things. But as you said, as you graduate, and it's like in some ways you homogenize more, right? Because on college campus, for me to walk from one experience to another geographically, like I could walk from my room and the track team to like Shirkan a cappella, or you could walk from the track to Rocky Matty Dining Hall, or like you can put yourself in quote unquote different rooms with very minimal geographic change or effort. When you're living in a town with people that mostly think the way you do, you're in Alabama with a bunch of white people who feel a certain way. For you to challenge that and really like get outside of yourself, it might be buying a plane ticket, for Christ's sake. So, you know, yeah, I think using college as an opportunity to like, listen, you can walk 300 meters to a different room with a different vibe and a different group of people, and challenge yourself to step outside of yourself and challenge your way of thinking, and make other people feel welcome, make yourself feel a little uncomfortable. And in that discomfort is growth and learning about what you care about, how the world functions, how other people experience the world. And I think I'm just realizing through this conversation that in very different ways, you had that at Princeton, you joined DZAC, you worked at Rocky Matty, you were on the track team, like, you were in Tower for a little bit. For those who went to Princeton that are listening to that, those are very different rooms that you were in.
I mean, they don't make any sense, to be honest.
That's the point, right? And like, I was in Shere Khan and in Ivy, that makes sense. But then I was living with track guys. That doesn't make any sense. And when you look at like, I actually called Jeremy, the guy I was talking about earlier, who works for the NSA. You put us next to each other, and I'm the consummate extrovert, loud, whatever. He is like deeply introverted. He does the Rubik's Cube in 16 seconds. He can do it blindfolded, collapsing the colors into a binary string of number. Like, we could not be more different. And yet when I look back on not only how I spent my time at Princeton, but the people that I hold dear now, they are so different from one another in almost every way. And so you and I both got this amazing experience of like, Princeton's this beacon that pulls in the best and brightest, whether it's one of the top 800 runners in the country, or a guy who can do the Rubik's Cube, or a guy who can sing really well, or a gal who can, whatever. And if you don't take advantage of that, what the fuck are you doing? You go to a place like that with all these different people, and you are just sitting with people that look and sound and smell and taste and everything just like you. It's like, that's a huge missed opportunity. So
yeah, I don't think people really think about their college experience starkly in those terms, and I don't think the college experience is really presented in that way either, in the way that it should be. Like, this is really an opportunity for you all to really expand what you know. That doesn't mean that you're going to be best friends, or going to find yourself at home in a space that's different than what you normally would find yourself in. But it's just to say that it is really important. I think it is critically important for people who are of different experience, people who are of kind of the more fluent, or people who are white experience, to really kind of engage with and learn more about people who are of different socioeconomic or different racial experience. I think that's critically important. And that's one of the things that's one of the reasons why I believe these colleges and universities really have an obligation to making sure to enshrining that some of this learning happens through course selection, through some sort of course that students are required to take, that really challenges students to learn about each other, to learn about to learn about multiple different perspectives. It's actually interesting. This is kind of switching gears a little bit, but the Woodrow Wilson School and the decision to change the name. So for those who don't know, Princeton University had a really prestigious school, public policy school, named after Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States, as many of you know, but he was also the president of Princeton before he entered into politics. And he is a tremendously important figure at Princeton University. He's the only Princeton alum to ascend to the presidency, so Princeton holds him very dear. However, he was also a virulent racist. That's not to mince words. Even for his time, he was pretty racist. He noted that he did not want, Black students at Princeton University, even though other Ivy League schools had Black students at their schools at the time. He resegregated the civil services that had been desegregated for 20 years. He resegregated them. So again, someone who, even for his time, was kind of extreme in his viewpoint. About 5 years ago, there were students on campus who protested and clamored and really tried to get the university to change the name of the Woodrow Wilson School because of Woodrow Wilson's terrible legacy.
I think they slept outside the president of Princeton's office or something. I mean, this was a real.
Right. So they took over his office for about 3 days, and then they got kicked out of his office, and then camped outside of the building for another series of days. I think it was a week or some change more than that. I wasn't on campus as a student at that point. I was working on campus at that time and training. So I did kind of see what was happening, but it was kind of from afar. But, if I'm mischaracterizing anything from that time, my apologies to the students who did that work. I want to give them credit, the Black Justice League, in the work that they did. The university responded, and the trustees came together, and their response initially was not to change the name. And so they didn't change the name, but what they did instead, they renamed a space inside the building and named it after some Black person who was important to the university, I believe. And then they also,
a bizarre response, by the way.
Yeah, and then they also commissioned. They did a few other things. They created, positions for diversity and inclusion. They earmarked some funds for some other stuff. And then they also created this roaming exhibit that went around campus that talked about the legacy of Woodrow Wilson and examining both his accomplishments, but then also some of the things that were troubling about his legacy. And that went around campus until it found a home, I believe, at the bottom of Robinson Hall, which is the building that the Woodrow Wilson School occupies or used to occupy. The school has since been renamed more recently, but I'll get to that in a second. My argument, I remember speaking with a trustee who was a young trustee who could not tell me exactly how he felt, but I can tell that he was not comfortable with the decision that was made at the time. I remember saying to him, okay, if the university doesn't want to change the name, that's one thing. But why are they doing this roaming exhibit, which is not going to have any sort of lasting institutional impact? What would really be helpful is if they said, listen, we're not going to change the name, but what we're going to do, we're going to create a course that every single Woodrow Wilson student must take that's going to look at Woodrow Wilson, but then also other historical people and events from multiple different perspectives, and then challenge the different viewpoints of those interactions. Like, for instance, the U.S. Involvement in Iran in the 1950s. We have a very specific view on our kind of intervention in that way, but there is an Iranian perspective that is probably a lot different than our perspective. And so having a course that really challenges and teaches students to look at multiple different perspectives and to assess things from multiple different viewpoints is important, especially as a school that's purporting to prepare students to go into public policy to do the nation's to do the work in the service of nations, right. Which is the motto of Princeton, but then also specifically the mandate or kind of, what the objective of that school is, even though a lot of students who concentrate in the public policy school end up into finance and consulting, that's a whole nother thing. But that school is really meant to help prepare, the next kind of generation of people who are going into public policy.
I think that is that's a great solution. And I think, there's a whole nother conversation. And in the second, Russell, I want to kind of come back to our outline and be like, what, if we're going to talk for another half an hour, what are the things? And we can do episode 2 if you want or whatever.
Yeah.
But Yeah, I mean, listen, people that go to schools like Princeton love to be like liberal arts education that teaches you how to think, blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, listen, there are a lot of things that you don't learn that you really need to. And dumb examples are like personal finance or like, like, why don't we learn about shit that's actually helpful instead of pontificating in some philosophy class? And then to your point, there are things that are so goddamn topical to our world right now that like what you just brought up, like really seeing things from other people's perspectives, or like you kind of alluded earlier to, like I would even add to that class a segment where you get paired with another student like you and I are doing right now. It's like, hey Russell, you grew up in Philly, I grew up on a farm in New Jersey, we come from completely different backgrounds. Like, what's Princeton been like for you? What's it been like for me? What have I, how can we learn from each other? Or like doing that on a class scale. So doing the macro of like, okay, here's a war, here's the American take, how did the country that was goddamn invaded feel about it, right? And look at those two perspectives on the macro sort of global scale. And then on the micro human scale, what does it feel like to be Russell Dinkins at Princeton? And what does it feel like to be James Cole at Princeton? And how can we have a mutual respect for each other? And like, we're on the same campus at the same time. And so by all accounts should have a similar experience, right? Wrong, very different experiences. And what is there to learn from that can bring us closer together? And when you scale that out, you make a friend for life, maybe out of like something like this, and if that happened at scale over the years through the Woodrow Wilson School, you could use that as a lattice to bring together different people from across campus. So I think it's a fantastic idea. And I just wish that the liberal arts sort of core education was challenged, and it wasn't just like philosophy and art history and like the same shit that my dad studied when he went to Princeton, say, but that we actually challenge and we're like, what are the things that people need to know or should know or could benefit from in 2020? And how can that be a core part of the curriculum so that everyone is taught to challenge their reality and experience of the world, or taught to challenge something or learn about personal finances? Or what are the things that we want to send the next leaders of our country out into the world knowing, other than some stuff about philosophy and art history and stuff that may or may not actually really be that relevant, to a modern world.
Right, and I mean, and I also think it's really important for people to have the skill set. I mean, it's a skill to be able to look at different experiences and be able to empathize with those experiences in a way to have a understanding of what racism and institutional oppression looks like, and to have an understanding of what it takes to kind of combat those forces. That's not to say oh yeah, we need to indoctrinate people with kind of like a liberal viewpoint. No, it's just to say, look, these are things that are institutionalized. These are ways that you can challenge those kind of assumptions. And these are the skill sets. Now, what you choose to do with those skill sets is your prerogative, but these are the skill sets. And I think the fact that, there are a lot of Princeton students who graduate who do not have those skill sets. I mean, you actively have to seek out those kind of, those kind of courses and those experiences. I think Princeton and all higher education institutions are doing their students a grave disservice, given that we are entering into a world that is increasingly becoming more, heterogeneous in some ways. But we're also seeing an intensification of people, in cities that are, more cosmopolitan, more kind of heterogeneous in some ways. However, we're also seeing some interesting divides occurring between, urban centers and rural, and then also between the people who are educated in terms of higher education or traditional education, and those who don't have those sorts of educational background. And I think it's going to be really important for people who are going to be entering into these different spheres. And let's face it, a lot of people who have had the privilege of going to places like Princeton, like, a Yale, like a Harvard, like a Duke, like where have you, there are going to be the people, who are going to be decision makers in a lot of the spheres, that they find themselves in, after a certain period of time.
And the
And
fact that
so,
those people don't have that education is a fucking travesty. I couldn't, and Russell, here's a stat for you, man. 35% of Americans go to 4-year college, and only 17% of Americans matriculate within a 10-year time horizon. So, and that's 4-year college period. And then if you want to talk about the upper tier, the Dukes and the Harvards and all the names you just mentioned, that's, the top of the top of the top of the 17%. And so when you're talking about, this is a very small sliver of society. And if they're going to have an outsized impact on the institutions that they go forward and lead, and they don't have this education, holy shit, that's a scary thought, right? Like, so I almost want to teach this class with you. Like, I want to do a Zoom that's like, hey, it's Russell and James's empathy class. And it's like, the problem is the people that would take it are the people that probably don't need it, right? It's a self-selection bias, but
yeah.
It's like, gosh, how can we get a group of people that couldn't be more different in a room together and like do some basic empathy training, whether it's students or people our age, man, that could benefit from really having discussions like this. So let's come back. I don't know how much more time you want to spend, or our listeners want to spend listening to us go on and on, but I have the track journey and what happened after Princeton. I have mental health. I have you penning an article that really saved the Brown University track program. And then I have sort of Black Lives Matter and systemic racism more broadly. So we could skip all of the sort of middle stuff and go right to Black Lives Matter and systemic racism as an outgrowth of what we were just talking about. Or we could save that for episode 2, or if you want to chat again, and stick more with, we could talk about mental health and kind of stick with this as a Princeton episode. Or we could stick with sort of track, because we talked about that quite a bit, and talk about Brown track, because we've talked about Princeton University and that interesting microcosm. It might be interesting to talk about how you could take your knowledge of how that functioned to have an outsized impact on Brown's decision-making. Is there something that you'd like to focus on for the last 20, 30 minutes, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think what probably makes the most sense is, since we spoke a lot about Princeton today, I think we can kind of stick with that, talking a little bit more about about mental health, about my experience running, at Princeton. I can even talk about, my post-collegiate running experience. And then, I certainly think, a conversation about Brown track, is really, really important. I think that kind of connects really well with larger discussions regarding Black Lives Matter, and some of that kind of more some of the issues that are broader. And so I think that might be good for a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, let's keep it on like mental health and Princeton and your experience, and I'll share a bit about mine and mental health. And then maybe next time, you can think about if you want to do this again. I'm really grateful, Russell, for your time. And I just, you and I said this before we started rolling, but I said this, and I don't know if you agree or not, but I said, gosh, I'm so excited for this conversation, and I wish that more people were having conversations like this right now, and trying to learn from each other and just listen from other points of view, like you were just saying. And so I'm really grateful for you taking the time. And it's just kind of cool, man, that we kind of overlapped and had these things in common. And now years later can maybe in another light, in another way, have things in common and learn from each other. I'm certainly learning from you just listening now. So I'm really appreciative. So yeah, think about if you want to do another round of this, but maybe for today, we'll just sort of cap off with talking a bit about mental health and how Princeton, it sounds like for both of us, really was the start of some rocky road there. And then next time, if people want to tune in for episode 2, we'll talk about what you did to really save the Brown track program, and maybe use that as a jumping off point for the larger conversation about Black Lives Matter and racism in our country more broadly. that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. So, I guess just to kind of, talk about my mental health journey. So I first kind of encountered, mental health struggles when I was a teenager, going into high school. We had a really bad kind of a family situation, and um, it really kind of affected me, really, really deeply. So much so that I ended up, becoming like pretty depressed over it. It was, it was a bad situation, and I don't want to get specifically into. I am not afraid to talk about the situation. It's just that the situation involves um, a family member who is too young to know exactly what happened, and I don't want, and she hasn't learned everything about it yet, and so
Yeah,
I don't want, I think she needs to be presented with that
of course,
in a different way.
of course.
But anyway, it was a bad situation. We all ended up being safe afterwards, but it was one, intruder type of situation, and so. My mom and I, we leapt into action, and we protected ourselves, and did what we had to do. But it was a very emotionally draining kind of thing to kind of heal from that, both physically and emotionally, and that kind of produced a major depression that I had my in a freshman year of high school, so much so that I ended up having to transfer to a boarding school in Massachusetts. And that actually, boarding school was actually one of the best things that happened to me in my life. So even though at the time it was tough to have to leave Philly, my family and my school at the time, knew that it was best for my healing to go to to get away from Philly, to be at a boarding school.
What boarding school did you go to?
I went to Wilbraham and Monson Academy. So it was a great school. I actually loved it. It was a boarding school it's a boarding school, but it's not a big feeder into like the IB. So it's not an Andover, Exeter, or Lawrenceville. It's a kind of a boarding school where you can kind of grow and develop and learn. They sent a lot of kids to a lot of smaller liberal arts schools, because the school itself was kind of within that model. The school
And
itself
that's
only,
packed.
yeah, exactly. The school itself is about 300 people, total. So it was a very small space, but it was one where I really developed. At Princeton, I had some bouts of depression. My junior year actually was very depressed. My junior year, so much so that I almost took a year off, and I really thought about it strongly. The only reason I didn't take a year off is because when I went to my mom, because I was really kind of looking for her blessing. She freaked out, and she heard time off as dropout. And it wasn't until years later that I kind of realized that even the idea of time off is a very privileged concept. Um, People don't take time off at non-elite institutions. Elite institutions, time off is like a thing, but at other institutions, people don't take time off. They drop out and they don't go back. And so, coming from that perspective, my mom, when I told her time off, she heard drop out, and that terrified her. And so I ended up just staying in Princeton because of that. And ended up graduating and being fine.
So
But
Russell, if you don't mind me asking, the depression when it came up when you were 20 years old as compared to 14 years old, do you see common threads in sort of what brought it on, or what did it feel like a very different set of circumstances that caused it?
it was a different set of circumstances, but I've kind of have had, one of my challenges and struggles, in which, a lot of people who have known me or interacted with me probably would not know, is that, I've had, struggle, like major struggles, like with self-esteem, throughout my life, just having, not really feeling, at times convincing myself that I'm not capable, or not able to do certain things, or or what have you. and those kind of struggles and challenges sometimes elevating or kind of producing a sort of uh, anxiety or depression around it. And so my freshman year
Can I
in
pause you
high
there really
school,
quick, Russell?
yeah.
Just 'cause I think that's such an important, powerful thing you just said. Like, I look at, again, we weren't best friends in college,
Hmm.
but I looked at someone like you in college and idolized you, right? Like, you were this like track star, you're this handsome guy, you're articulate, you're in DZAC, you're in this, you're in that. Like, DZAC is like the pinnacle of the dance community. You're the pinnacle of the track team. You're like a man about campus, right? And so someone like that, everyone thinks has it all figured out, and he can be in great pain. And I've had the same experience because I'm very loud. I think a lot of people think I'm very confident, or sometimes even cocky. Like, people tell me, like, I always thought you were so cocky. It's the same thing, and I remember in my lowest point of depression, I was like just Googling a bunch of shit, and I ended up on a lot of Michael Phelps content. I don't know. He's been a big spokesperson for mental health, and almost committed suicide at one point. And I just remember thinking to myself, because exercise is something that helps with depression, as you know, among other things. I remember thinking, like, here's this guy who's won like 20 something gold medals. He's at the top of the world. He's loaded. He's in peak physical shape. Diet's perfect. Like, he's doing everything right. And yet this guy wants to kill himself. Like, what am I supposed to do? So anyway, I just think it's important to pause on that thought, because there are a lot of people that look at someone like you. I looked at someone like you, or even people that have looked at me that didn't know me that well and have told me later, and they're like, you have it all figured out. It's like, no, man, like, it's not that simple, and more people than you think can be hurting, and they have their own cross to bear. And I think that gets back to that empathy thing you were talking about before, which is like, just because Russell's ticks certain boxes, or he seems like he's got it all figured out, he's got some shit going on, man. And like, that needs to be met with empathy, love, patience, and understanding, not just assuming he's fine because he's got a few things figured out, or worse, like being jealous of him, or sort of, I wish I were more like him, and so I actually discredit him a bit. So I just think that's important for people to understand.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly. I mean, sometimes, you know, um, likewise. I mean, I remember you were making like these awesome, like, films, and you're into your photography, and things of that nature. Actually, I actually had your camera bag when I went to Kenya, and I had to give it back to you when I got back in 2012, I think, because I helped Don move out of the patent room, and it was like a bag that was left there, and I was like, oh, this would be perfect for my trip to Kenya. And then
I wish you'd kept it, dude. That'd be like a big feather in my cap. Russell Dinkins uses my camera bag, baby.
No, I think we met up, and then I gave it back to you. Yeah, so you got it back at some point.
I forgot that.
Yeah, but yeah, so yes, I mean, you're someone who I definitely saw as, having a lot of talents, and even now, you've been kind of, have started multiple businesses and things of that nature. And so, but I think we all have a story that kind of doesn't necessarily, reflect all the times what the outside kind of image presents. And everyone has their own different journeys. Everyone doesn't deal with depression in the ways that I have, or you may have. But mental health, nevertheless, is something that is more pervasive than I think people really like to think about. And it is a challenge that a lot of us do have to kind of deal with kind of silently. And so I remember my anxiety my junior year was really having this crippling fear that I was going to graduate Princeton and not have anything to show for it, to be kind of, I really had a fear that I was going to just be like a bum on the couch when I graduated Princeton. And it's kind of bad because, you know, my mom is really big on not necessarily putting energy into that which you don't want. Um, and, you know, I, you know, put a lot of energy into that thought. And, you know, last year was another time that I dealt with some depression, unfortunately. And last year was the lowest I had been since I had graduated college. And I ended up being in a position where I was out of a job. I had exhausted most of my reserves, like my money reserves, and I was just like sitting at home on a couch. And I was like, this is exactly what I did not want to happen. And this is where I am. And so that was a kind of a painful kind of place to be, and to kind of realize that I had kind of made that reality happen because I, you know, kind of put that negative energy out there. Yeah. And it was really kind of a situation of my own doing, and it's something that I had to kind of you know, really kind of deal with. So long story, well, just to do a little bit of a recap. So I was working at Princeton University after I graduated in training. Things were going really, really well in all those fronts. The last 6 months, however, everything started falling to crap. I got a new manager, and that situation didn't really work out well. I got injured doing a workout, and so everything that was going really, really well suddenly turned really sour. And I ended up, my contract ended with Princeton. But when my contract ended with Princeton, I was just in a really bad emotional state because of dealing with a lot of the stress that I had to deal with at work. And that just put me in a really bad spot. So I kind of convinced myself, okay, I'm just going to just avoid everything. So I just like did not work for like almost a year. And then kind of focused back on training. And so last year I was training really, really well, but I wasn't really dealing with the emotional side or the fact that I was avoiding work because I was emotionally kind of pained from, you know, from my last work experience. That was really, really emotionally taxing and draining. I just had an extreme micromanager situation, and I did a lot of things wrong. I'm not going to say it was all, you know, just that person. But I had a lot of things that kind of impacted, you know, my confidence, you know, so much so that, you know, there were kind of inquiries to like see my emails before I sent them out to other people and stuff like that, you know, just things that, you know, really didn't make me feel that I was capable. But I also learned through that process that I also allowed myself to be vulnerable in that situation, to be emotionally scarred in that way. And so there's also kind of responsibility that I have to take as well. But anyway, long story short, I was training really well, but I was kind of avoiding work or the emotional aspects of it. You know, I kind of just like got to a point where I just realized, wow, I haven't been working for a year. I've been avoiding work. All the money I had saved is now almost gone. And then, of course, since I, you know, was training really hard, but not doing other things like getting physio because I, you know, couldn't afford it, I got injured right before nationals last year. And that was the most heartbreaking thing because I was in the best shape I had ever been in my life. Like my workouts were the best I've ever done. And so I knew that I was finally like close to actually making it to that next level that I've been working towards ever since I graduated. The highest I've finished, my highest ranking in the US has been 15th in the US. And the training I was doing last year far superseded when I was 15. And so I really feel like last year I had the potential to, you know, enter to that top 5 in the US for my event. But, you know, that's only speculative. I did not allow myself to have that opportunity. And so, you know, this past year actually has been really, really interesting and nice, kind of healing myself from, you know, those kind of emotional wounds that I, you know, that I kind of had more recently, but then also kind of learning about, you know, what I need to do to better support myself and to better ensure my own personal success and happiness. Everyone's kind of depression kind of manifests in different ways. My depression kind of manifests into really poor decision making and a little bit of self-sabotage. And that's kind of been a hard thing to kind of deal with and to confront, but it just is what it is. And everyone is different. I don't drink or smoke or do any of those kind of vices, but when I get in a really bad or depressive
Torture the
kind of
shit out of
mood.
yourself with your mind.
What do you say?
I said, but you torture the shit out of yourself with your mind,
Oh yeah.
It's interesting. I just have a few comments that I wrote down as you were speaking. One thing is and I've seen this. I have the privilege of knowing a lot of elite athletes or just elite people, and to be that good, to be fifth best in the country at something. Think about that. If anyone watching, what are you good at? How good are you at it? And if there was an objective way to measure it, would you be 100th best, 1,000th best, 10,000th best? Fifth best? Holy shit. You have to be so laser focused on that. And a lot of the other things that we all do to build up our self-esteem or to build up our sense of self, things that we sort of spend time on, friends, family, hobbies, and so on, a lot of that has to fall by the wayside when you're pursuing something the way you were. And so, you don't have a lot of self-confidence infrastructure, shall we say, right? So much is riding on those training times. And I've seen this with other athletes, other friends, where, when you're so singularly focused on something and you don't get it, it's so brave to pursue that goal because it means that you gave up so many other things along the way. And when you fail, you don't have a lot to catch you as you fall, right? So that's one interesting thing is, I think about this with entrepreneurship, man, the door that opportunity that you have to open to let opportunity in, the chance to be great. You also are letting in supreme risk, would be disappointment. They come through the same door, right? And you can't have the one without the other. So without risking a ton, you can't gain a ton, to put it simply, is sort of how I think of it. And I always tip my hat to people, be them entrepreneurs or athletes or what have you, that are courageous enough to pursue a version of themselves that is so great and therefore so single-minded, because I know how vulnerable they are to letting themselves down. And then the second thing, my ex gave me a book, and a quote from it always stuck in my head, which you basically just said verbatim earlier. I think about reality a lot, and I'd love to talk to you more about reality. It's sort of a heady topic, but when you really start breaking down sort of what you were talking about earlier, Iran and the United States looking at the same war very differently. It's the same set of facts, but very different realities for different parties. Something you just said reminded me of this quote, which is that we think, I think that reality happens and then we think about it. So things are happening in the world and that's reality. And then Russell's all right, this is what I think about it. But your mom, and I think you think that you think about things and then reality happens. So, right, there's this sort of unspoken conceptualization of reality, which is that it's happening out there and then we react to it. But some people think that this shit's happening in here, which manifests a reality. And which way does it flow? And you're sort of saying, listen, there was this guy that was micromanaging me. There were externalities that kind of fucked me up. But I also am partially to blame because I was creating a negative reality and manifesting it outward. It wasn't just the things outside coming in. And I think it's important to think about both of those things when conquering depression. What's out there that you can control, avoid, do less of. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't, hang out with people that bring you down. But then the way you speak to yourself and the way you conceptualize and visualize the future that you want and the power that you actually do have over that, which will then inform the ensuing reality, is so important. And taking that ownership as you have, I think, is an important step. just maybe to end it on a positive note, and for a lot of people in this country have depression. 1 out of 12 or something like that. So guaranteed there are 10, 15, 20 people listening that were hanging on your every word as you were describing your experience. Could you maybe share, so you sort of described 3 moments, one when you were 14, one when you were 19 or 20, and one when you were 28 or so, of valleys. Are there any things you've learned along the way of how to get yourself out of those valleys and kind of get yourself back on track and feeling a little happier about yourself? Is there advice that you have other than, running 800 meters in less than a minute 45 seconds? Because not everyone can do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think everyone's journey is different. And even my journey, it's different. And so when I was a 9th grader, my depression was really, really bad. So much so that I went to outpatient therapy, and then I actually had to go to inpatient therapy twice. I was starting to get into a little bit of self-harm. So it was bad. And so much so that I had to, get medicated. And so I was on Prozac for about a year. And then, eventually was able to, able to get off of it.
Did that help?
It did. So I think medication is great. I remember I promised myself, though, that I would never take medication again. And not because I'm against medication. I just promised myself, okay, this was an emergency situation and I needed it. I am not going to ever be back in this place where I'm going to need this again. And it's kind of like what I told myself, just because I don't ever want to be back in that place. And so that is, something I told myself, back then, and it's my hope that I, will not ever have to revisit that place again. I'm a person who doesn't need medication, kind of on a consistent basis. It was, for a kind of an acute kind of depression. But that's not to say that medication is not useful or should not be considered for people who need it, whether it's for an acute instance or if it's for overall kind of functioning for their life for their life. Everyone has a different kind of experiences with that. The other 2 times, I sought out kind of someone to talk to, help, which was really helpful in both of those instances. This latest instance, though, I've really kind of been thinking about the fact that, personally, and I haven't done this yet, and I haven't put it into practice. So, it's kind of a challenge to myself. But
also, I'm going to publish this, dude. It's going to be up there. You better do it now.
Yeah, I got to do it.
Hold you accountable, dude.
Yeah, no, that's true. But one of the things that I learned kind of about myself, during this last depressive episode is that, I am prone to having these depressive moments. And so since I am prone to having these moments, instead of seeking out, I'll go talk to a therapist for for 5 months, and then I'll get, to a place where my depression is manageable by myself, and then I'll stop talking to the person, and then I'll kind of get it from being manageable to not being depressed. Instead of thinking of it in that way, what are some things that I can do that can instill kind of, really positive, kind of self-affirming kind of practices into my life that provide me with the resiliency such that, things like a boss who's being, an aggressive micromanager doesn't tip me over, the edge so easily. Because there are going to be those external inputs that you can't control, What you can control is how, you react to them. And it's not an issue if you are kind of more vulnerable in some ways. That's okay. But what you can do is you can work on those vulnerabilities. You can work on those soft spots, just like you train, your muscles. If you are an athlete and if you are if you're a soccer player, you know what I mean, and or if you're a basketball player and that you're not really good at free throws, you're going to practice those, right? You're going to work on your weakness. Going to work on it. I don't want to frame it in terms of weakness, though. I want to frame it in terms of soft spots. I want to frame it in terms of, areas that you may be vulnerable.
Yeah, man. I do this thing called CBT. I don't know if you've heard of it, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think you could really, I think you'd really like it, just given your temperament and how militant you've been about your training with running. One of the core tenets of CBT is that things happen. Then you have thoughts about those things, and then you have feelings that come from those thoughts. And a lot of people go from a thing happening, like you said, like a stressor, like the micromanaging boss, and it goes right to feelings. Like, boss did this thing, I must not be good enough because he needs to read my emails before they're sent out in the world, and I'm 27 goddamn years old. Mm-hmm. Like that's a very causal thing. We all do that, right? Where something happens and then we have some sort of self-effacing thought, feeling, really, like I'm not good enough or something. And that there need to be thoughts that are injected between the things that happen. And you don't necessarily have control over your feelings, but you do in fact have control over your thoughts. And so how you speak to yourself, it's been very helpful to me. And it's sort of a simple thing to say, but it's quite hard to put into practice. Something happens and you stop and you pause. And what is the talk track, and how does Russell get from micromanaging boss to I'm worthless because he needs to read my emails? Like, what did we just skip over? What were like the 3 or 4 thoughts that you could have or should have had in between? And how can we control that narrative where it's like, hold on a second, I went to Princeton, I'm really smart, I'm doing a great job at this job. I care and love about, I love myself and care about myself, etc. And then when you get to the part where you should have the feeling, you're no longer kicking your ass because you're not worth anything. You've actually gone through 3 or 4 thoughts of I am worth something. Okay, cool. And now it doesn't bother you quite as much. So I call it the seawall, where like these waves are smashing up. And if you can build up this wall of resilience and of self-talk that's positive instead of jumping right to the negative feeling. It's been hard, but the past 6 months I do 4 hours of this kind of therapy a week for the past 6 months. So like intensive shit. I've never done inpatient or outpatient, but I might as well with 4 hours a week of this. I love my therapist who does it. And it's been truly life-changing for me to realize that I actually do have control over this beast, and that I actually, by controlling my thoughts, can prevent a lot of pain and a lot of negative feelings. So it's just something you should look into. And if you want to talk about it offline, I'm always here, man. And with depression, like it can be very lonely to feel low, but then also to feel like other people don't understand what you're going through. So, now that we've reconnected, I'd love to be here for you if that's of help, at any time.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And, it's also, great to, to have, someone, to connect with on that. So, also, the door's open in the other way as well. So, yeah, this is awesome. Well, thank you so much, James, for bringing me on. And
yeah, Russell, really appreciate it, man. And yeah, I'll publish this, in the next day or two, and have a think if you want to. If we do an episode 2, it could be about brown track and sort of the larger issues our country's finally facing, and maybe what we can do, what I can do, what someone like me can do, what someone listening can do to help be a part of the solution. in a pretty charged situation where it's easy to feel helpless. So I think just your wisdom on that as someone who has done his homework and has already had more than anyone I know personally, you've had an outsized impact on really helping a lot of people in this weird time, in this very charged time. So I think I'd have a lot to learn from you, and whoever listens would as well. So definitely
Cool, yeah.
put a thought and we can figure it out.
I definitely feel like that deserves its own conversation. So
For
all right,
sure. Yeah, I'm glad we didn't try to do a 4-hour marathon right now.
Yeah, this isn't a Joe Rogan experience. So
That's right. That's right. All right, man. Good to talk to you. Thanks.
You too. Take care, man.
Russell.